The next topic has to do with glandular structure. And so we associate secretion and absorption with the epithelial tissue. And what glands are, whether they are ductless and ductless without tubular organization. So ductless are like you think of hormones, and hormones are secreted right into the bloodstream or the interstitial. Actually, hormones are secreted in the bloodstream. You also have some compounds that are secreted into the interstitial fluid, and those would be ductless, without a duct. And then you have the exocrine glands that have a duct system. But the thing about each of those is these epithelial cells have been specialized to secrete. And there are a couple of different ways that the specialization can take place. The first one, the first type is the first at the top here, and that's the merocrine. At the top, you have merocrine glands. You find those. What happens with this is there's a secretory vesicle. So there's a vesicle. Remember, those vesicles are created by the Golgi apparatus. Something is created, whatever this gland is going to secrete, and put into a package that then can become one with the apical surface of the cell membrane and released out into an opening, whether that opening be the surface of the lumen or whether that opening is a duct. That's that particular type of secretion. The second type of secretion is an apocrine type secretion, and what this is also a vesicle, but what happens is a portion of the cytoplasm breaks off, and this is a little bit different in the fact that you have the Golgi apparatus is still going to make is going to make a wall of, is going to remake the apical surface of that epithelial cell, and the portion that is excluded from that remake, I guess you might say, will break off, and that then will release into the surface of whatever area it is or into the tube. The third type is the halocrine gland secretion, and with this one, this is a little bit more dramatic for the cell. What happens is the cell matures. As it matures, it bursts open, and the contents of the glandular secretion is released in that bursting open action. After the cell bursts open, it dies. And so what you have are these cells constantly being replaced, which epithelial cells are anyway, and moving up to the outer surface of whatever this gland is. And when you think of this particular one, you're thinking of sebaceous glands. You're thinking of oil glands. Oil glands tend to, oil glands do work this way. And then the second thing about glands, particularly exocrine glands, remember endocrine glands have no ducts. So that's why we're only talking about exocrine here. Endocrine, you associate those with your hormones, those chemical messengers. Exocrine, think of sweat glands, think of salivary glands, think of mucus glands that you find in the body. So they can be simple tubular glands, excuse me. And so again, the secretion can happen any of those three ways, but generally the secretion is going to happen the merocrine gland way in simple tubular, or that simple tube can be coiled, and that's where you have the type of sweat glands that are merocrine type sweat glands, simple coiled, simple tubes. Most of our sweat glands are this type. They're also known as eccrine glands. And you have a simple secretion from here. And then you have branched tubular, and examples gastric mucus glands of the esophagus, tongue, and duodenum. And they become a little bit more sophisticated, and certainly as you get into glands that can secrete more than one thing, get to be much more sophisticated, and maybe something can secrete mucus and it can secrete digestive enzymes, not so much this particular one. But in the gastric pits, there is a mucus secretion, and there's also the hydrochloric acid and other types of chemicals that are created and needed for digestion that takes place in the stomach. Then you have alveolar. We find these in the respiratory tract, and then branched alveolar. Branched alveolar are an example of your oil glands or your sebaceous glands. The simple are only found in, are not found in adult. Let me backtrack on that. That particular term, acinar, is better if we use simple acinar, because that term alveolar is something we do associate with the lungs, so just not to confuse. You don't find those in adults. It's a stage in development with regard to simple developing into other types of glands, most likely the simple branched. And so glands have ways that they secrete, 3 different ways, and designs of their ducts. And that word is D-U-C-T-S, duct system. Compound glands, so it gets a little bit more confused, that can be tubular, acinar, or a combination of the two, so tubular, alveolar. And with tubular, you think of a type of gland that is creating a secretion maybe that's a little bit more involved. Certainly mucous membranes in the mouth secreting mucus, but you also have maybe lysosomes in there, peroxisomes, and the glands of the bulbal urethral glands for the reproductive system in the male, and also the seminiferous tubules that in the testes. What happens there is multiple steps take place, so multiple activities are happening, so the gland needs to be a little bit more complex because of that. And certainly the middle one, the alveolar, acinar gland, we think of the milk that is produced via mammillary glands. Milk has more than just a lactose protein. There's more in there. There's antibodies in there. There's other proteins in there. So all of that gets secreted. So when you think of these compound glands, think of multiple things that have to mix together to create the secretion that goes to the surface. And then the third type, the tubuloalveolar, certainly salivary glands, pancreas. Pancreas, very, very complex in the secretions, and so the more complex the duct in your head at this point, you're thinking of multiple compounds involved in the secretion that makes its way to the surface. All right, we're finally done with epithelial tissue. I know it took a long time, but it really is a very important grounding this whole chapter is very important in grounding in terms of understanding information that comes forward. The next type of tissue, remember there's 4 types. We finished 1, we're on to 2, don't get discouraged, is connective tissue. And this is kind of the catch-all tissue. It fills spaces, supports other tissue, transports materials, and stores energy, otherwise known as, think of fat. Transports materials, think of blood. Supports other tissues, think of collagen fibers, elastin fibers. Fills internal spaces, you can think again of fat-type tissue. Now, fat itself, that adipose cell, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but that's fine, is not the connective tissue portion. It's a specialized cell that's bedded into the fibers of connective tissue. So one of the reasons why we have so much connective tissue in the body is that you have this thing called a matrix, and that matrix is kind of like a house that you can have these specialized cells embedded in. And depending on how that house is structured, we have the types of connective tissue and then also the arrangement of connective tissue. And we'll talk more about that. Characteristics, you have these specialized cells. Like I said, adipose cell is one. A fat cell is a type of specialized cell. You have these protein fibers that are considered some of the strongest material you have in your body. Think collagen. Think long strands of protein fibers. Protein is a very complex molecule, as I say often, and you have long strands of them. It can also be very fluid. Blood is a connective tissue, and so you can have a fluidity to it or a lack of fluidity, because bone is also connective tissue. And you have this ground substance concept with connective tissue, and what ground substance is, so extracellular, outside of these specialized cells, made up of fibers, collagen, elastin, and just fibrin fibers. That's not right. I'll get that in a second for you. And this makes up the matrix part of the tissue. In terms of function, it, just like the name says, it connects, it supports. With fluid materials, it creates the atmosphere or the house for your formed elements to live in, so for your blood cells to live in. Protects organs. Fat is a very protecting tissue. Supports, when you think of supporting the organs, or supporting, you're thinking of ligaments in terms of support. Stores energy in the form of triglycerides, and defends the body from invading microorganisms, certainly with mast cells or specialized cells embedded in it. So understand that connective tissue itself isn't necessarily doing this. It's the cells that are embedded and are housed in the connective tissue that do these functions. Here's a nice image of connective tissue. I think I repeat it later in the lecture. This is an artist rendition of a generic connective tissue fiber, which really doesn't exist because you don't have all these fibers in the same place. So you have adipose cells which store fat in the form of triglycerides. In terms of the invading organisms, you have your lymphocytes and you have your mast cells. Those are going to help keep us safer from pathogens. You have your blood cells. That's the blood cell. The function of the blood cell, the red blood cell, is to transport oxygen. Plasma cells, these are cells that are able to release the precursor to your antibodies. Macrophages, these are the eater cells. You have your fibers in there, your collagen fibers, your elastin fibers, and also your reticular fibers. Those are the ones I was trying to think of, your reticular fibers. Fibroblasts are what give rise to all these types of fibers. And then you also have in here what is known as a melanocyte. This is a specialized cell that can be embedded in connective tissue to give us our skin color. It's part of what gives us our skin color. Plus also it helps protect us from UV light. And I think I will move on to the next slide, and this is the slide we'll pick up again with the next lecture.